as the situation between Israel and Iran escalates, showing potential for the risk of war. We have to consider the actual capabilities that Iran has, what is true and what isn't regarding its military capacity. And that's what we're going to look at in today's video. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know, because your support is very, very important for me to keep bringing content to you. After all, this is the only real geopolitics channel in Portuguese, and your support is very important. I'm Delian Peta, and this is World Geopolitics. For this video, I structured it into topics to make it easier to understand, and it is also focused on the structure, doctrine, and the perception that Iranians have regarding their security and defense issues. And not just listing the types of vehicles they have, because there are already many channels that do that, and the first thing we need to understand is the historical context. Because it's not just about geopolitics. I already made a video about Iran's geopolitics here, which I'll highlight in the description of this video, but to understand the history of evolution in the Iranian context. Because when we talk about Iranian military thinking, there are two events that will shape Iran's military rationale, because all of their strategic theory today is based on these two past events. Trying to isolate how we got here will lead the observer to understand absolutely nothing, and just analyzing which vehicle is better, which vehicle is worse, which misses the true potentialities. Around Iran, the first issue was the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the second, the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. Until the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian military structure was heavily based on equipment and military doctrine from the United States. But the rise to power of the Ayatollahs would cut the ties between Tehran and Washington, and this would suffocate the Iranians in acquiring new American equipment and spare parts for maintenance. Despite the popular outcry against the armed forces after the revolution, this was strongly discouraged by the revolutionary authorities. The government of the Ayatollahs made efforts to prevent and, whenever necessary, suppress such popular actions from other factions against the armed forces. Despite the enormous distrust towards the military and the formation of the Revolutionary Guard in parallel with the regular state forces, this revolutionary process did not result in major purges, which spared the backbone of the Iranian armed forces, keeping it functional. This made it possible and forced the Iranians to adopt their own military model, even though it had an American heritage, but they would have to improvise to remain effective. For the Soviets, this distancing between Iran and the United States was a gap to be filled, with the Soviet Union being the first state to recognize the new government of the Ayatollahs. But with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, being adamant that Islam was incompatible with communist ideals, especially because of atheism, the relationship between the two became lukewarm. During the Iran-Iraq War, Moscow directly supplied Saddam Hussein with large quantities of weapons, and also to Iran, secretly and indirectly, through North Korea. However, despite official United States embargoes behind the scenes, Washington also maintained the supply of weapons, as became public with the Iran-Contra scandal in 1986, which brings us to the second event that would shape Iran, the Iran-Iraq War. Officially, Iran was isolated, with the Soviet Union and the Gulf royal families formally supporting Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They feared that the Iranian revolutionary fervor would spread, reaching other royal families in the region, especially the Jordanian and Saudi ones. But it was not in their interest to have a strong Arab nationalist leader like Saddam Hussein, who could unify the Arab world, nor to strengthen the Islamist royal families too much. Which led to, as I mentioned earlier, both the United States and the Soviet Union secretly and unofficially supplying Iran as well. It was actually in the interest of both Washington and Moscow for the Arab world and the Persian world to keep fighting each other. The Iranians suffered heavy defeats at the beginning of the war, with Iraq, which was better equipped, even using chemical weapons against them. But strategic adaptation, a large number of soldiers, combined with the effective use of their vast and mountainous geography, ended up wearing down the Iraqi forces, to the point where they were no longer effective on the Iranian front, This taught the Iranians how their technological and material shortcomings would be a problem in the long run, as new, more lethal, and more precise technologies emerged. They might not have the same luck as before, and would soon have to address this vulnerability. So, we come to the issue of Iranian perception, since these two events I mentioned were the ones that shaped Iran's military outlook. The structure of Iranian defense has always been aware of this technical and numerical gap and inferiority compared to the United States and other Western forces. So, they focused on three things. Since the early 2000s, especially after the Iraq War in 2003, when it seemed inevitable that Iran would be the next target after Iraq. The first was to modernize its military capability technologically, at least enough to have some equivalence with Western forces, especially in its anti-aircraft and electronic capabilities. The second was to buy time and obstruct the geopolitical ambitions of the West and the Sunnis in the Middle East, through indirect wars using Shia militias for irregular warfare, and by proxy. And the third, the development of its nuclear and ballistic capabilities. Looking back 20 years now, this assessment has proven to be correct. Because when we look at the world of 2003, while the United States was invading Iraq, the Iranians also had to worry about Western forces occupying Afghanistan. And with bases positioned to the south in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and in the northwest of the country in Azerbaijan, and also the NATO member Turkey, which served as a territorial platform for attacks against Iraq and could do the same against Iran. At the time, an invasion of Iran seemed inevitable, but as the war in Iraq became bogged down and in Afghanistan dragged on without results, the imminent invasion was replaced by the prospect of imminent American airstrikes. What the Iranians learned is that Iraq was falsely accused of having weapons of mass destruction and because of that was invaded, while North Korea, which actually did have them, was seriously threatened with invasion. This equation showed the country's elites, the Ayatollahs, that if Saddam Hussein had actually possessed nuclear weapons, he wouldn't have been killed. Therefore, they should also have them to ensure their survival. The Iranians waged wars in northern Iraq against the United States occupation forces. Through Shiite militias that were trained by their elite force, the Quds force, and in some operations, the Quds themselves acted directly. This bought them more time, and the imminent American bombing gradually ceased to exist, and it was replaced by the then imminent Israeli bombing, who kept accusing Iran of secretly developing nuclear weapons. In this sense, NATO's interventions in Libya and Syria in the early 2010s taught the Iranians that Western air superiority could drag a country into misery, even without troops on the ground, which made the Iranians quickly rush to develop and increase their anti-aircraft capabilities, especially by acquiring devices like the S-200 and S-300 from Russia, in addition to a heavy investment in developing their own technology for detection and anti-aircraft defense systems in partnership with Chinese and Russian engineers. Although the exact depth of this cooperation is not known, so Israel's main problem for any attack on Iran today is twofold. The first is how to attack so many targets spread out across a large mountainous country that has a large number of anti-aircraft defense systems. And second, how to reach Iran without alerting the Iranian detection systems. The Israelis therefore were faced with a dilemma because one option would be low-altitude flights trying to avoid Iranian radars. But because of the low altitude, it creates more air resistance and, as a result, increases fuel consumption. This would force some of their planes to refuel in flight, which would increase the chances of alerting Iranian defenses. Or fly very high, avoiding air resistance and thus saving fuel, but running the risk of the attack being detected too early. And I find it impressive how the reading of geography and logistics determines whether an event will actually happen or not. Because most YouTube channels that set out to do poor war analysis simply ignore how things need to be moved and how extremely difficult that is. Anyway, this huge logistical difficulty, combined with the civil war in Syria, which would become the new stage for the Shiite militias and later for the Quds forces themselves, made the Israeli bombing inevitable. Gradually into something forgotten, which finally brings us to today's situation. The Hamas attacks and the Israeli counterattack in Gaza have been inflaming the circumstances involving Iran and Israel, which would lead Israel to act in Syria in April 2024 and, as a consequence, Iran to respond with attacks against Israel. Regarding this event, it's complicated because the situation is that, according to Israel, it was not the embassy that was attacked, but rather the building next to the embassy, which belonged to the Revolutionary Guard. Therefore, this would mean that international laws regarding attacks on embassies would not have been broken. But according to Iran, the building was an annex of the Iranian embassy and was directly connected with an external sign. In fact, by making this official, however, the satellite images do not make it clear whether there was a continuous connection between the two buildings or not, which makes the situation quite ambiguous. Therefore, the only one who could determine the truth of the facts would be the Syrian government, which, due to administrative authorizations such as construction permits, diplomatic authorization, and so on, would actually know the official status of the building. But as we know, Iran and Syria are allies. So, whether true or false, the Syrians would confirm the truth and authenticity that it was part of the Iranian embassy. In other words, we will never find out the truth because this will be part of the narrative war on both sides. Those who are pro-Israel say it wasn't an embassy, and those who are pro-Iran say it was an embassy. So I think it's not worth focusing on who's right, but rather on the mathematical calculation of forces and events, which brings us again to the threat of war between the two countries. The logistical difficulties that I mentioned for Israel so far in attacking Iran remain the same. Although it's been a few years now that Israel has some units of the American F-35 fighter jet which could make this attack a bit more feasible. So to speak, although its effectiveness in the event of an attack against Iran remains uncertain. On the other hand, an Iranian attempt to move troops against Israel is also unrealistic, given the number of soldiers they would need to move and the amount of equipment they have for that today. They would still have to cross two countries with very poor infrastructure. However, the difference lies in the use of drones and missiles, which allow for attacks that would previously be either unfeasible or too risky. So we have the current military structure and the current military condition of Iran nowadays. At first glance, it may give the impression of weakness and being outdated, but a closer look will show that's not the case. The Iranians adapted in the way they could, with the few resources they had, building an alternative force to modern warfare, which is quite efficient. So it deserves caution in terms of strength. Today, Tehran maintains two armed branches, the regular army and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. While the regular army protects the territorial integrity of the state, the Armed Revolutionary Guard acts as the guarantor of the regime and the guardian of the revolution. One important thing to keep in mind about the Iranian power structure is that Iran is not a dictatorship in the literal sense of the word. The regime is not centered around a single personal figure, as it was with Saddam Hussein in Iraq or with Putin in Russia, but around an assembly of Shia clerics who share state authority with a president who is popularly elected. Due to this decentralized setup, Iran is much more of a kind of semi-democracy, and not in fact a dictatorship in the pure sense. This mention I make is important because the Revolutionary Guard, formed in 1979 when the revolution happened, has always been preferred over the conventional army, which was seen as ideologically suspect. They ensure that Tehran exerts regional pressure through direct and indirect actions, being responsible for the country's missile arsenal, both surface-to-surface and surface-to-air. However, the division between the two armies is economically inefficient and duplicative, spreading the available resources more widely than would otherwise be the case. The Revolutionary Guard mirrors the three branches of the regular armed forces, with land, naval, air, and space units, maintaining a close association with the leadership of Iran. Its aerospace force, that is, the missile force, is responsible for the inventory of short and medium-range missiles, which is the center of its deterrence policy today. Meanwhile, its Quds force is tasked with supporting militias or non-state actors in regional conflicts that promote the country's geopolitical objectives. Despite ties to the government elite, the Revolutionary Guard struggles with its equipment. Just like the regular armed forces, with the exception of some types of missiles and drones, most of its equipment is obsolete. Its main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles are similar to those of the regular army, mostly made up of old models. The most modern tank in its arsenal is the T-72S, acquired through negotiations with the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And its armored vehicles are mostly of Soviet origin, with designs dating back to the 1950s and 1960s. And although Iran claims to have domestically produced tanks like the Kahar, it has never actually been used in battle. So we don't know if it is actually effective or just propaganda. Its Air Force officially has American F-14 fighter jets acquired before the 1979 revolution. But, besides being inadequate for the air theater of the 2020s, it is still suspected that it might not even be operational. Its Air Force also has other fighter jets, such as the Russian Mikoyan Gurevich, 29 the Chinese F-7 Chengdu, the French Mirage, and the American F-5 and F-4, in addition to a few domestically developed copies in small quantities. But all of them are either inadequate for a 2020 air combat scenario or suffer from a lack of spare parts. Recently, the arrival of Russian Su-35 fighter jets was announced, which should partially revitalize its air capability, especially in the country's territorial defense. Since they would hardly be used offensively outside the country, given the enormous risk that would entail. This difficulty in maintaining an air force is mainly due to the costs and the difficulty of accessing replacement parts on the global market, which led to their extremely old Su-22s, which were retired and in storage, being partially reactivated. But, like the others, it would hardly stand a chance in a modern combat scenario. Of course, with the exception of the Su-35, which is still in the process of being delivered. The Iranian anti-aircraft systems, as was exposed in the attacks they suffered in Syria, remain deficient when operated in small numbers and isolated, and apparently they can't handle the F-35 fighter jet, which forces Tehran to have to keep large numbers concentrated in regions with strategic targets. Although Iran has suffered greatly from a lack of foreign technical assistance and technology, immediately after establishing its ballistic missile program back in the 1980s, they have since made enormous progress in achieving self-sufficiency. Interestingly, through the acquisition of missile technologies on the black market and their own development. The recent developments in Iran's ballistic missile program can be summarized in the following points: emphasis on improving accuracy and therefore the usefulness of their systems. Development of fixed launch sites and mobile vehicles to increase survivability. Production of solid-fueled missiles for a more responsive force and construction of underground storage and launch sites to increase their survivability. So, we have missile technology, which may be the most important aspect of Iran. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal has a very large range and depth. It is estimated that Iran operates at least 20 different types of systems, and the United States Central Command estimated in 2022 that Iran has more than 3,000 ballistic missiles of all types and at different ranges, from short to medium and long range. Despite Iran's clear interest in having a large arsenal, its leaders have taken a pragmatic approach, prioritizing the development of increasingly advanced systems and halting the production of equipment considered outdated. The halt in the production of Shahab 1 and 2 stage short-range ballistic missiles, which are mobile, in 2015, and the shift to developing the improved variant, such as the Qian-Y, is an example of this. This approach has been guided by the Iranian leadership's desire to improve the utility and lethality of its ballistic missile arsenal. Accuracy was improved through the modernization of guidance equipment, including ground-based, terminal, and strap-down guidance systems, which are a type of guidance system used in missiles and other guided weapons, where the guidance sensors, such as gyroscopes and accelerometers, are mounted directly on the warhead section of the missile, usually at the top, and they are fixed directly to its structure, instead of being mounted on a rotating platform inside the object. The Sajal 2 medium-range ballistic missile, which is two-stage and mobile, for example, could benefit from an upgrade with a more modern strap-down guidance system. Similarly, an updated version of the mobile, liquid-fueled Qian-Y short-range ballistic missile may have been equipped with a new guidance package. Given the evident accuracy of the missile when it was used in the attack against United States forces at an airbase in Iraq on January 8, 2020, The Fatah missile class has also received several guidance improvements, including the addition of an electro-optical seeker for terminal guidance for the mobile, solid-fueled Fatah Mobim variant. This variety of solid and liquid-fueled devices means that Iran has solid-fueled ones for quick response and liquid-fueled ones at a cheaper price. According to reports from the United States government, it is believed that Iran has fewer than 100 mobile launchers for its short-range ballistic systems and about 50 launchers for its medium-range ballistic missiles. And it has made some effort to standardize the design of its launch vehicles, transporters, and mobile launch vehicles. Ballistic Missile Program. In terms of the number of systems it has and the variants of different types of systems it deploys, as well as the large number of manufacturers involved in the development and production of military and dual-use equipment. The Iranian Aerospace Force uses a wide variety of different types of launchers, some of which can be disguised as civilian vehicles. This issue of having so much variety is a problem but also an advantage because on one hand, this great variety makes the program very expensive, but on the other hand, it causes problems for defensive systems. When dealing with so many different devices that could come from Iran, Iran's mobile launchers can be divided into two categories: main military vehicles and civilian vehicles which have been adapted to launch missiles but are disguised as civilian vehicles. The first group consists of launchers that are purposely designed as military vehicles, although some designs produced in Iran are derived from civilian vehicles. Several custom-built mobile launchers designed to carry and launch different types of ballistic missiles, including the DSFU and the Zolfalgar Basir. Another is the Soviet-designed launcher vehicle used to transport and launch missiles, the Scud B and C, the latter of which Iran received from North Korea as early as the 1980s. In addition to using mobile launchers to improve the concealment and survivability of its ballistic missile arsenal, Iran has several underground missile storage and launch sites for similar purposes, which is an advantage in such a mountainous country. This type of structure gives Iran the ability to pre-position equipment that can act as force multipliers, reducing the vulnerabilities of Iranian ballistic missiles to attacks. It potentially forces an adversary to use significant amounts of ammunition to disable or damage well-protected launch sites. It increases Iran's ability to fire large salvos of missiles in rapid succession and reduces the risk to Iranian military personnel, if command and control can be safely located away from the launch sites. Although their aerospace force has used underground missile storage sites for launch vehicles since at least 2015, it seems that Iran has designed more advanced complexes that use reloading and launching equipment. While the underground storage sites previously designed by the Aerospace Force are well protected under mountainous terrain, their usefulness may be reduced if an adversary blocks the entry and exit of mobile launch vehicles by targeting the tunnel entrances. Iran seems to have made some attempt to minimize this vulnerability, as some of its new sites appear to feature internal automated rail systems to transport missiles through the tunnels, along with rotary magazine silos and launch silos. This would allow for quickly moving missiles within the tunnel complexes, faster reloading, and launching salvos of missiles from inside the complex in rapid succession, storing missiles. In this way, it also increases the amount of available space, since there is a great need for space for long-range missiles. Iran also appears to have developed and implemented a system for bearing ballistic missiles, which is somewhat different from a traditional underground missile silo. During Iran's Great Prophet 14 exercise in July 2020, they announced the successful launch of ballistic missiles in a completely camouflaged manner. The missile test footage shows the hot launch of an unidentified type of ballistic missile from a camouflaged hatch. So we have the other asymmetric issue, where they have heavily invested in and developed drones, and just like they have focused on militias to deal with larger threats in an asymmetric way. They have also been pioneers in the use of drones, precisely because of their cost effectiveness, since drones have supplemented the shortcomings they have with equipment that would cost millions and millions of dollars. And it allows them to address these gaps with most of their domestic industry. And it's interesting the great advances the Iranians have made with drones, especially the Shahed 131 and 136, This second one is the one we saw debut in Ukraine after being sold to Russia. The components recovered in Ukraine from the 136 and in the Middle East from the 131 seem to be very similar, because the wreckage of the Shahed 136, which was used in Ukraine, alongside the 131 which was used in Iraq, shows that the systems have the same size and shape and were built using similar materials and subcomponents, as well as the same honeycomb-shaped structure inside the fuselage. The use of these drones has a worrying impact for Israel, because even though the Iron Dome has been 99% effective in defense, supposedly because that's only according to the Israeli government, and this hasn't been confirmed by any other independent source. Iran's ability to use these drones puts financial pressure on the Israelis, because in the battle on April 13th they spent more than $500 million, while Iran, we don't know, but probably just a fraction of that. The lowering of war costs caused by drones has impacted Ukraine and will be a problem for Israel's future. Iran's drone warfare programs have advanced much faster than expected. From platforms limited to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, that is, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to attack capabilities. This marks a valuable indicator that shows Iran's trajectory. A 2019 report highlighted that Iran was on a very fast trajectory in the manufacturing and development of drones, and this has now been confirmed in 2023 and 2024. This is exemplified by the transition from the Mohajir-1, which was used only for monitoring during the Iran-Iraq War back in the 1980s, to the Mohajir-6, which is now considered an effective asset for attack operations. This evolution represents a major leap in the military potential of the Iranians, allowing them to project power and influence on a broader level than before. In addition, Iran has not only developed its own drone capabilities, but has also become a supplier of these technologies to Russia. This partnership highlights Iran's growing importance on the international stage as a significant player in the field of military technology, something that was previously unusual. Another thing is the integration of missiles and drones in mixed attack packages, as we saw in Israel, representing a shift in the Iranians' military strategy. This approach challenges conventional defenses and allows Iran to carry out more complex and coordinated operations, and at a relatively low cost. And within this context, we have the icing on the cake, the nuclear issue. Because considering its advanced missile aerospace program and its interesting drone program, this is a point that will make even more of a difference in the future, its nuclear factor. Because what has become clear is that if Iran develops full nuclear capability, which involves not only the creation of nuclear weapons, but also the miniaturization of the warhead so that it can fit into its already sophisticated missile technology, Israel would then have an extreme problem on its hands. The Iranian nuclear program has been dispersed and spread throughout the country, not concentrated, so that, in case of attacks, the entire program wouldn't be lost all at once. Just like what happened with the Iraqi nuclear program in 1981 when Israel in Operation Babylon destroyed the plant that was under construction. This makes it harder to completely neutralize their nuclear program. With the fall of the Soviet Union, relations between Tehran and Moscow experienced a sudden increase in diplomatic and commercial ties, with Russia soon inheriting the arms agreements that existed between the Soviets and the Iranians. And, by the mid-1990s, Russia had already agreed to continue working on the development of Iran's nuclear program, with plans to finish the construction of the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which had been delayed for almost 20 years since the early 2000s. The construction of uranium enrichment facilities using gas centrifuges in Tehran has been the main source of concern regarding the potential development of nuclear weapons. Gas centrifuges enrich uranium by spinning uranium gas at high speed to increase the concentration of the uranium isotope. These centrifuges can produce both low-enriched uranium, which is used in nuclear reactors, and highly enriched uranium, which is one of the two types of fissile material used in nuclear weapons. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is an agreement signed between Iran and Germany, China, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Russia, from 2015, it requires the Iranians to place several restrictions on their nuclear program as well as to accept specific inspection requirements. But President Donald Trump announced in May 2018 that the United States was ending its participation in the agreement. After that decision, Iran stopped implementing most of the agreement and accepting monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The expansion of Iran's enrichment program has reduced the time needed for them to produce a sufficient amount of highly enriched uranium which can be used in nuclear weapons. The restrictions that the agreement had imposed on Iran's nuclear program kept it under control, ensuring that for at least about 10 years Tehran would need at least a year to produce enough highly enriched uranium to be used in a nuclear weapon. But the number of centrifuges installed by Iran, the mass, and the concentration of uranium-235 in Tehran's enriched uranium stockpile are above the limits required by the agreement. The Iranians still do not have a viable nuclear weapon design or a suitable explosive detonation system for it. And they might also need more experience in producing uranium metal, which is a weapons-grade enriched metal, for use in a nuclear weapon. Up until the moment I'm recording this video, Iran would not have resumed work on its weapons research. Iran will need about a year to complete the weaponization steps, that is, to turn this technology from civilian use to being used as a weapon. So for now, there is no evidence that points to the Iranians actually trying to develop nuclear weapons. And even if there were, according to American intelligence, it would take about a year. Besides that, they still don't have the technology to miniaturize nuclear weapons, which means making the nuclear device fit inside their missiles so it can be launched toward the target. But of course, that's assuming they don't get help from a country that already masters all these technologies. And in that sense, even though Russia and China have posed as strategic-level partners, neither of those countries wants a nuclear Iran that could, in the future, turn against their interests and try to act on its own. And right at the heart of the Middle East divide with Central Asia, on the other hand, a country that has historically assisted Iran in various ways has been North Korea, which for now until April 2024 does not have miniaturization technology. But if they manage to obtain it, they could help the Iranians in exchange for scarce resources for the Pyongyang regime, but of course this is speculative. But so far, it would be the only way for Iran to speed up this minimum 1-year time frame to develop its nuclear weapons. And it would take several more years to be able to miniaturize them. So, what becomes more or less clear regarding this Iranian military structure is that despite not having enough resources to modernize its army, in the traditional and large-scale way, they prioritize strategic points that end up being effective in the long run and undermine the interests of richer powers in a cheaper and more efficient way. Whether this will work or not, only time will tell. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Consider becoming a member. Not only will you be helping the channel a lot so it can keep going, because right now, the only way the channel can exist is with the help of members. Plus, you'll also get 1 month early access to the videos here on the channel, and also to the full podcasts, exclusive live streams with me, and exclusive videos from some courses that I made available for members. Hugs and see you in the next video.